My name is Daniel Harper. I'm 32 years old. And 3 years ago, my mother laughed in my face when I told her I was quitting my job to start my own company. Last week, she walked into my office asking if we were hiring. But the moment that really started, everything happened during a family dinner on a quiet Sunday evening. At the time, I was 29 and working a stable corporate job in a mid-sized marketing firm downtown. On paper, it looked like the kind of career most parents would be proud of. I had a steady salary, predictable hours, and a title that sounded impressive enough during family gatherings. But every morning when I walked into that office, I felt the same thing: restless. The work itself wasn't terrible. I was good at it. And over the years, I had even started managing small projects for clients. But the more experience I gained, the more I realized something important. The strategies I was creating for other companies could easily become something of my own. For months, I had been working on a plan during evenings and weekends. I researched markets, built a small client list through freelance work, and slowly started outlining what my own marketing consultancy might look like if I ever had the courage to leave my job. Eventually, I reached a point where the idea stopped feeling like a distant dream and started feeling like a real opportunity. So one Sunday night, while sitting at the dinner table with my family, I decided to tell them. My parents lived in the same house where I grew up, a quiet suburban place with a large wooden table in the dining room that had seen every birthday, holiday, and family argument for as long as I could remember. My father was cutting into a roast while my younger sister Emily scrolled through her phone beside him. My mother sat at the head of the table as usual, carefully arranging plates like she always did. I cleared my throat. "I've been thinking about something," I said. My mother glanced up. "That usually means trouble," she replied with a half smile. "I'm serious." That got their attention. "What's going on?" my father asked. I took a breath. "I'm planning to leave my job." The reaction was immediate. Emily looked up from her phone. "Why would you do that?" My father frowned slightly. "Are they laying people off?" "No," I said. "It's my decision." My mother put down her fork. "Then what exactly are you planning to do?" "I want to start my own business." The room went quiet for about 2 seconds. Then my mother laughed. Not a polite chuckle, a full, surprised laugh that echoed off the dining room walls. For a moment I thought maybe she had misunderstood me, but she kept shaking her head, still smiling. "You're serious?" she asked. "Yes." That only made her laugh again. "Daniel," she said, wiping the corner of her eye, "you can barely keep a houseplant alive." Emily snorted quietly beside her. "And you think you're ready to run a company?" My father didn't laugh, but he didn't defend me either. He just leaned back in his chair with the same skeptical look he always had whenever someone mentioned starting a business. "That's a big risk," he said. "I know. Most businesses fail in the first year." "I'm aware of that." My mother shook her head again. "I can't believe you're even considering this." "It's something I've been working toward for a while," I explained. "I already have a few freelance clients and—" She interrupted me with a small wave of her hand. "Freelance clients are not the same as running a company," Emily added quietly. "Sounds like one of those YouTube entrepreneur ideas." I felt my jaw tighten. "This isn't a random idea. I've been planning it for months." My mother leaned forward slightly. "Let me ask you something," she said. "What happens when this little experiment fails?" The word experiment stung more than I expected. "I don't think it will. That's what everyone says in the beginning." My father took a sip of his drink. "You have a stable job, Daniel. People work years to get where you are." "I know that." "Then why throw it away?" "Because it wasn't the life I wanted." But explaining that felt pointless now. My mother leaned back in her chair again. "Well," she said casually, "just remember one thing." Her voice had lost the humor now. "Don't come back asking us for money when this fails." The sentence landed on the table like a final decision. No one argued with her. For a moment, I just sat there, staring at the half-finished meal in front of me. Then I quietly stood up. "Dinner already?" my father asked. "Yeah," I said. My mother didn't even look concerned. She simply picked up her fork again. Good luck with your little company. I left the house that night knowing one thing with absolute certainty. If this business failed, I would be proving her right. But if it succeeded, 3 years later, she would be sitting in my office asking for a job. The truth is, my mother laughing at the idea of my business didn't surprise me. Not really. By the time that dinner happened, I had already spent most of my life being the person in the family whose ideas were taken less seriously. In my mother's eyes, success followed a very specific formula. You studied hard in school, you found a stable career with a respectable company, and you stayed there long enough to build security. Anything that involved risk, uncertainty, or unconventional thinking made her deeply uncomfortable. And unfortunately for me, I had always been the child who leaned toward those kinds of ideas. My younger sister Emily was the opposite. Emily was organized, cautious, and extremely good at following the exact path my mother believed in. She graduated near the top of her class, went to a well-known university, and eventually landed a position at a large accounting firm. Every time someone asked my mother about her children, Emily's achievements came first. Emily works at one of the best firms in the city, she would say proudly. Then she would mention me. Daniel works in marketing. It wasn't meant to be insulting, but it always sounded like an afterthought. Part of the problem was that my career path had never looked as impressive on the surface. Marketing is one of those fields where titles and responsibilities don't always translate clearly to people outside the industry. My job involved developing strategies, managing campaigns, and helping businesses grow their customer base. But when I tried explaining that during family conversations, my mother usually summarized it in a simpler way. So basically, you make ads. Over time, I stopped trying to explain the details. But the real difference between Emily and me wasn't just our careers. It was the way we approached the future. Emily believed in stability. I believed in possibility. Throughout my 20s, I had experimented with different side projects. Some of them were small freelance campaigns for local businesses. Others were marketing experiments where I tested new strategies online just to see what would happen. Most of those ideas didn't lead anywhere significant, but each one taught me something. The problem was that my family only saw the attempts that didn't succeed. Every time I mentioned a new idea during family gatherings, my mother reacted the same way. "You're always chasing something new," she would say. "Why can't you just focus on a stable career?" I tried explaining that marketing was exactly what I was doing. The only difference was that I wanted to build something of my own eventually, instead of spending my entire life building someone else's company. But to my mother, entrepreneurship sounded reckless. She had grown up in a household where financial security was the most important goal. Her parents worked the same jobs for decades, saved carefully, and avoided any risks that might threaten their stability. That mindset shaped the way she saw the world. In her eyes, leaving a stable job to start a business wasn't brave. It was irresponsible. So when I told my family about my plan that Sunday night, her reaction wasn't really about the business itself. It was about everything she believed success should look like. After I left the dinner table that evening, I sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes before starting the engine. Her words kept repeating in my mind. "Don't come back asking us for money when this fails." She had said it so casually, as if failure was the only possible outcome. And maybe that's what hurt the most. It wasn't that she doubted the business, it was that she doubted me. Eventually, I drove back to my apartment and opened the notebook where I had been writing down ideas for months. The pages were filled with plans, research, client lists, and financial projections that I had carefully built during late nights after work. For the first time, the entire plan felt heavier, not because I believed she was right, but because I realized something important. If I went through with this decision, I would be doing it without any support from my family. No encouragement, no safety net, no one cheering when things got difficult. Just me, and the idea I believed in. The next morning, I walked into my office building like I had done hundreds of times before. The elevator ride to the 12th floor felt strangely different that day. For years, that building had represented security and stability. Now it felt like something I was about to leave behind. By the end of the week, I handed in my resignation. My manager looked genuinely surprised. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "Yes. What's the plan?" "I'm starting my own consultancy." He studied me for a moment before nodding slowly. "Well," he said, "that's a bold move." Bold. It was the first time anyone had described my decision without laughing. 3 weeks later, I officially launched my company. And that was when reality started hitting much harder than my mother's doubts ever had. Because believing in an idea is one thing. Surviving the first year of a business is something else entirely. The first morning after I officially launched my business, I woke up earlier than usual. For the first time in years, there was no office to drive to, no morning meeting waiting on my calendar, and no manager expecting a status report by 9 o'clock. Instead, I walked to the small desk in my apartment, opened my laptop, and stared at the company website I had spent weeks building. At the top of the page was the name of my new business. Seeing it there felt exciting and terrifying, because now everything depended on me. The first few weeks were filled with optimism. I reached out to contacts I had worked with during my corporate job, sent emails to small companies that might need marketing support, and spent hours refining proposals for potential clients. Some people responded politely. Most didn't respond at all. Every day followed the same routine. I would wake up early, check my inbox, review my financial spreadsheet, and calculate how long my savings would last if no clients signed contracts. The answer wasn't comforting. I had saved enough money to survive for about 8 months if I lived carefully. That meant every week without income felt like a countdown clock ticking in the background. 2 months passed, then 3. The first small project I landed barely covered a month's rent. Still, it was something. I threw myself into that project as if it were the most important contract in the world. I stayed up late reviewing analytics reports, rewriting campaign strategies, and adjusting budgets until the results improved. The client was happy. But the project ended quickly, and suddenly I was back to zero. Around that time, my family started checking in. Not out of curiosity, out of skepticism. Emily sent a message one afternoon. "How's the entrepreneur life going?" The words looked friendly on the surface, but I could almost hear the quiet amusement behind them. My mother's approach was less subtle. One evening, she called while I was reviewing marketing data. "So," she said, "have you found a real job yet?" "I'm working," I replied. "Working doesn't mean profitable." That sentence lingered in the air. "I'm building something," I said. "Well," she replied calmly, "just make sure you remember what I said about asking us for money." I remember, after that conversation, I stopped discussing the business with my family. They had already made up their minds about how the story would end. The hardest moment of that first year came during month 6. I was sitting at my desk reviewing my bank account when I realized something uncomfortable. If things didn't change soon, I would run out of money in about 8 weeks. 8 weeks. That number stayed in my head all day. I started questioning everything. Maybe my mother had been right. Maybe the business idea wasn't strong enough. Maybe I had walked away from a stable career for something that would never work. For the first time since leaving my job, I opened a job search website. The listings looked familiar. Marketing manager, campaign strategist, brand coordinator. Positions very similar to the one I had left behind. For several minutes, I just stared at the screen. It would be easy to go back. All I had to do was apply. But something stopped me. Instead of sending applications, I closed the website and returned to my contact list. If the business was going to survive, it needed one thing. A real client. Not a small freelance project. A company that trusted me with something substantial. That night, I spent hours rewriting my outreach emails and refining my pitch. I contacted businesses I had been too hesitant to approach before. Mid-sized companies that could actually afford long-term marketing support. Most of them didn't reply. But 3 days later, one email arrived that changed everything. It came from a regional logistics company I had contacted earlier that week. The message was short. "We received your proposal. Can you come in tomorrow to discuss your strategy?" I read that sentence 5 times before it fully registered. The meeting the next day lasted almost 2 hours. They asked difficult questions about marketing channels, customer acquisition costs, and long-term growth strategies. Fortunately, those were the exact topics I had spent years working on in my previous job. When the meeting ended, the director shook my hand. "We've been looking for someone who understands both strategy and execution," he said. 2 days later, they signed a 6-month contract. It wasn't just a project. It was enough revenue to stabilize the business. For the first time in nearly a year, the pressure in my chest eased. Because the company that almost disappeared during its first year had just found the client that would keep it alive. And that contract would become the foundation for everything that happened next. Landing that first real client changed everything. At first, the difference wasn't dramatic. I was still working alone in my small apartment, still handling every task myself, and still carefully watching every dollar that came in and out of the business account. But something important had shifted. For the first time since launching the company, the future no longer felt like a ticking countdown clock. It felt like momentum. The logistics company didn't just give me a contract, they trusted me with their entire digital marketing strategy. That meant redesigning campaigns, restructuring their online advertising, improving their customer acquisition funnel, and helping them understand how to turn website traffic into actual clients. It was the kind of work I had done for years at my previous job. The difference now was that the results belonged to my company. I treated that project like it was the most important opportunity of my life. Every week I sent detailed reports explaining how their campaigns were performing. I adjusted strategies quickly when something didn't work and doubled down on the tactics that showed promise. Within 3 months, their online leads had nearly doubled. The director who had hired me called one afternoon. "We're seeing better results than we expected," he said. "That's good to hear. We'd like to extend the contract." That extension was the moment when the business stopped feeling fragile. Soon after, the logistics company recommended me to another business they worked with, a regional manufacturing firm that was struggling with its online presence. That second contract allowed me to do something I had been dreaming about for nearly a year. I hired my first employee. Her name was Rachel, a talented graphic designer who had been freelancing for several companies, but wanted more stable work. Bringing someone else into the company felt like crossing an invisible line. The business was no longer just me sitting alone at a desk. Now it was a real team. As the months passed, more clients started appearing. Some came through referrals, others through proposals I had sent months earlier that companies were finally ready to consider. The workload grew quickly. Before long, my apartment office wasn't practical anymore. Client meetings felt awkward when they happened in a living room that still had a couch and a small kitchen visible in the background. So I rented a small office space downtown. It wasn't glamorous. The building was older. The conference room was barely large enough for 4 people, and the furniture came mostly from secondhand stores. But when I walked into that office on the first morning, seeing my company's name printed on the door felt like a quiet victory. 2 years after leaving my corporate job, the business had grown enough to support a small team. Rachel was joined by a campaign strategist and later a junior analyst who helped manage the growing number of clients. What had once been a risky experiment was now a stable operation. Yet strangely, my family barely acknowledged it. During occasional phone calls, my mother would ask vague questions about how the business thing was going. Her tone usually sounded polite, but distant, as if she assumed it was still a small side project that would eventually disappear. Emily once visited the office briefly while she was downtown for work. She looked around the room, glanced at the team working at their desks, and said something that still stuck with me. "So this is your little startup?" Little. At the time, we were managing marketing campaigns for several companies across the region. But to her, the idea of me running a business still didn't quite register. And my mother? She still believed something else entirely. In her mind, I was probably just getting lucky. Because 3 years after that dinner where she laughed at my plans, something happened that finally forced her to see the truth. It started with a simple message from my assistant one Monday morning. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "I don't have a meeting scheduled." "I know," she replied. "She said it's personal." I stepped out of my office and walked toward the reception area. And the moment I saw who was sitting there, I understood exactly why she looked so uncomfortable. Because the woman waiting in my lobby was my mother, and she wasn't there to laugh anymore. She was there to ask if we were hiring. For a moment, I just stood there. 3 years earlier, my mother had been sitting at the head of our dining table laughing at the idea that I could run a company. Now she was sitting quietly in the reception area of that company, holding her purse in her lap like someone waiting for an interview. She looked up when she noticed me. "Daniel." Her voice sounded different from the confident tone I remembered from that dinner conversation. There was hesitation in it now, and something else I couldn't quite place at first. Nervousness. My assistant glanced between the two of us. "Should I give you the conference room?" she asked. "That's fine," I said. I led my mother down the hallway toward the small glass-walled meeting room at the end of the office. As we walked past the workstations, my team continued typing and reviewing campaign reports, barely noticing the quiet tension following us. Once we were inside the room, I closed the door. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. My mother looked around the office through the glass walls. She could see the employees working, the company logo mounted on the far wall, and the large screen displaying analytics data from one of our client campaigns. "You built all of this?" she asked quietly. "Yes." She nodded slowly, still taking everything in. "It's bigger than I expected." I pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "So," I said calmly, "why are you here?" She took a breath before answering. "The company I worked for had layoffs last month." That caught my attention. My mother had worked at the same insurance company for nearly 20 years. It was the exact kind of stable, long-term job she always encouraged. "They eliminated your position?" "Yes." Her voice was steady, but I could tell it hadn't been easy for her. "What are you planning to do now?" She hesitated. "That's actually why I came." The meaning of that sentence was obvious before she even finished saying it. "I heard your company has been growing," she continued. "Emily mentioned you have several employees now." "That's true." She folded her hands together on the table. "I thought maybe you might be hiring." There it was, the moment that had once existed only in my imagination. 3 years earlier, she had laughed at the idea of this business even existing. Now she was sitting inside it asking for a job. For a second I said nothing. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I remembered something very clearly. "Don't come back asking us for money when this fails." The words echoed in my mind with surprising clarity. My mother noticed the pause. "I know what I said back then," she said quietly. I looked at her. "Do you?" "Yes," she sighed. "I may have underestimated you." That was the closest thing to an apology I had ever heard from her. The room fell quiet again. Through the glass wall, I could see Rachel walking past the conference room carrying a folder of campaign reports. My mother followed my gaze. "You have employees now," she said. "Yes." "And clients?" "Yes." She nodded again. "I suppose you proved me wrong." There was no bitterness in her voice, just a strange mix of pride and humility. Then she looked directly at me. "So I'll ask the question properly." She straightened slightly in her chair, as if she were preparing for a real interview. "Daniel, are you hiring?" The power dynamic between us had completely reversed. 3 years ago, I had been the one trying to convince her that my idea deserved a chance. Now she was the one waiting for my answer. And the decision I made next would define the ending of this entire story. For several seconds after she asked the question, I didn't answer. Not because I didn't hear her, but because the moment felt strangely surreal. 3 years earlier, I had stood in my parents' dining room explaining my plans for the business. I remembered how confident I had felt describing the idea, how much preparation had gone into that decision, and how quickly that confidence had been crushed by a simple laugh. Now the same person who laughed was sitting across from me, waiting to hear if I would give her a chance. I leaned back slightly in my chair. "What happened at your company?" I asked. My mother sighed. "They merged with another insurance group," she said. "When that happens, they start eliminating duplicate positions. So they downsized." "Yes." She paused for a moment. "I thought my job was safe." Her voice carried the quiet shock of someone who had spent decades believing stability was guaranteed. "You worked there almost 20 years. 22. That number hung in the air for a moment. 22 years in the same company. My mother had built her entire worldview around the belief that long-term loyalty to a stable employer was the safest path in life. And now that path had disappeared overnight. "I'm sorry that happened," I said. She nodded slowly. "So am I." Then she looked around the office again. "When you told us you were leaving your job, I thought you were throwing away security. I remember you were earning a good salary. You had benefits, retirement contributions, everything people are supposed to want." "I know." Her eyes returned to mine. "But I didn't understand something at the time." "What's that?" "That security doesn't always mean safety." The honesty in that sentence surprised me, she continued. "When the layoffs happened, I realized something uncomfortable." "What?" "I had spent 22 years believing I was building something stable." She gestured slightly toward the office around us. "And in the same amount of time, you built something of your own. 3 years." It had only taken 3 years for that difference to become clear. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said something I had never expected to hear. "I was wrong to laugh." The words were quiet but unmistakable. "I shouldn't have dismissed your idea like that." I studied her expression carefully. There was no sarcasm there, no pride protecting her, just honesty. "You really believed I would fail," I said. "Yes. At least you're honest." She gave a small, tired smile. "I've had a lot of time to think over the past month." "What did you conclude?" "That sometimes parents assume they understand their children better than they actually do." That was probably the most self-aware sentence I had ever heard from her. Through the glass wall, I could see my team continuing their work. Rachel was reviewing campaign analytics with one of our junior strategists, and the quiet hum of conversation filled the office. My mother followed my gaze again. "You built a real company here." "Yes, and people rely on you. That's part of the job." She nodded. "Which is why I understand if the answer is no." Her voice softened slightly. "You don't owe me a position here." That part was true. From a purely professional perspective, hiring family members can be complicated. It changes the dynamic inside a company and sometimes creates expectations that have nothing to do with performance. But the bigger issue wasn't business. It was history. 3 years earlier, she had dismissed the idea that I could even run a company. Now she was sitting inside that company asking for work. The situation had come full circle, and the decision I made next would determine how that circle closed. The room stayed quiet for a few moments after my mother finished speaking. She had said something important without fully realizing it. "You don't owe me a position here." She was right. Running a company had taught me something that corporate jobs rarely make clear. Every hire matters. Every person who joins the team affects the culture, the workflow, and the trust between employees. Hiring someone simply because they were family would be the worst possible reason, but refusing her just to prove a point wouldn't be the right reason either. I folded my hands on the table. "You understand that if you work here," I said, "it wouldn't be the same as working anywhere else you've been before." She nodded. "I assumed as much. This company isn't run like the place you worked for 20 years. Everyone here started from nothing. We work long hours sometimes, and we solve problems quickly." "I'm not afraid of work." "I know you're not." That had always been true about my mother. She was disciplined and reliable. Her biggest flaw had never been laziness. It had been certainty. Certainty about what success should look like. Certainty about which risks were acceptable. Certainty that my path couldn't possibly work. I leaned back slightly. "There's also something else you should understand." She waited. 3 years ago, you told me not to come back asking for money when this failed." Her expression tightened slightly. "Yes, I didn't forget that." I didn't expect you to. The honesty in her voice made the conversation easier. When you said that, I continued, I realized something important. What? If the business was going to work, it had to work without anyone else's approval. She nodded slowly. That makes sense. And now that it's working, I need to protect what we built here. She looked around the office again. I can see that. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I opened the folder sitting on the table between us. Inside were several documents we used when interviewing potential hires. My mother looked down at them, confused. What's that? Our hiring process. Her eyes widened slightly. You're serious? Yes. I slid one of the documents toward her. If you want to work here, you apply the same way everyone else does. She read the first page carefully. Operations coordinator. That's the position we're currently filling. What would I be doing? Helping manage schedules, client documentation, and internal communications. It's not glamorous work, but it's important. She considered that for a moment. You wouldn't make me a manager? No. The answer came without hesitation. Everyone here earned their roles through experience with this company. If you join, you start the same way they did. Instead of being offended, she nodded thoughtfully. That's fair. It's also important that the rest of the team sees you as a coworker, not the boss's mother. She smiled faintly. That might take some adjustment for both of us. She sat quietly for another moment before finally looking up. Then I'd like to apply. I pushed the form slightly closer to her. Fill that out. She picked up the pen. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the quiet scratch of ink on paper. Watching her complete the application felt strangely symbolic. 3 years earlier, she had dismissed the idea that I could run a business. Now she was applying to work inside it. When she finished writing, she slid the form back across the table. I glanced at it briefly before closing the folder. We'll review this with the hiring team, I said. She raised an eyebrow. You're not the only one deciding? No. That made her smile again. You really built something here. Yes. She stood up slowly. I'm proud of you, Daniel. The words were simple, but hearing them meant more than I expected. Thank you, I said. As she walked toward the door, she paused and looked back at me. You know, she said, 3 years ago, I thought you were making the biggest mistake of your life. And now, she glanced around the office one more time. Now I think I might have underestimated you. I smiled slightly. That seems to be a pattern. She laughed quietly before stepping into the hallway. A few minutes later, my assistant knocked on the door. Everything okay? She asked. Yes. She looked toward the reception area where my mother had just left. So, was that your mom? It was. And? I closed the folder containing the application form. She just applied for a job? The assistant blinked. That's a new one. I leaned back in my chair, looking out through the glass walls of the office we had built from nothing. 3 years earlier, my mother had laughed at the idea that I could run a company. Now she had walked into that company asking for a chance to work there. And strangely enough, that felt like the most satisfying ending the story could have.